Donald Trump set a deadline designed to break a country. August 19th, 2026, midnight, 50% tariffs on $20 billion of Canadian goods. He expected Ottawa to panic. He expected Mark Carney to call, concede, and cave before the clock ran out. Instead, 3 days before that deadline hit, it was the President of the United States who blinked first, posting on social media that he was pausing his own tariffs because, in his words, the two sides finally had a deal. Not a victory lap, a pause, a retreat dressed up as diplomacy. This is the story of how a trade weapon built to force submission ended up forcing concessions out of Washington instead, and almost nobody watching the headlines understood why. If you want to understand how a Depression-era law aimed at Canada turned into one of the most quietly humiliating outcomes of Trump's second term, stay with this video because the numbers tell a story the press conferences never will. Before we go further, hit subscribe, because this channel breaks down exactly what the mainstream coverage leaves out, and there is a lot left out here. Let's rewind to where this actually started, because the ending only makes sense once you understand how aggressively this began. On July 20th, 2026, Trump signed 3 separate presidential proclamations invoking Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. That statute had not been used to impose a tariff since 1949. 77 years of sitting untouched in the federal code, and Trump's legal team dug it out specifically because it required no investigation, no congressional vote, and no formal trade review. The president could act by proclamation alone, and the clock would start the moment he signed his name. That clock ended on August 19th. The reasoning behind the move traced back to February 2026, when the Supreme Court struck down the tariffs Trump had been using under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That ruling gutted his most flexible trade weapon overnight. So his administration went hunting for a replacement, and what they found was Section 338, a Smoot-Hawley-era provision that predates the World Trade Organization, predates the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and predates nearly every modern trade institution governing international commerce today. Legal scholars immediately flagged the obvious problem. The Trade Expansion Act of 1962 and the Trade Act of 1974 were widely understood to have superseded Section 338's authority decades ago. Reaching back that far into the legal archive to bypass a sitting free trade agreement was not just aggressive. It was, according to multiple trade law firms, an open invitation for a court challenge the moment the tariffs took effect. The 3 proclamations targeted very specific grievances. Alcohol, because Canadian provinces had pulled American liquor off government store shelves in a coordinated response to Trump's earlier tariffs. Dairy, because Canada offered the European Union more generous cheese quotas under its CETA agreement than it offered the United States under the existing North American Trade Pact. And motor vehicles, because Canada had slapped a 25% surtax on American-built cars that didn't comply with the Continental Trade Agreement, itself a retaliation for Trump's steel and aluminum tariffs from the year before. Each proclamation carried the same penalty, a 50% additional duty stacked directly on top of whatever tariffs already existed. And crucially, this 50% applied even to goods that fully complied with the existing trade agreement between the two countries, the very agreement Trump himself signed and celebrated during his first term. That detail blindsided trade lawyers across Washington because compliance with that agreement was supposed to be a shield. Section 338 tore the shield away entirely. The dollar figures were significant, but not, in the grand scheme, enormous. Roughly $20 billion in Canadian goods across 554 separate tariff lines. Wine, cement, furniture, clothing, wood products, and yes, hockey sticks. All suddenly facing duties that, in some cases, stacked on top of existing steel and aluminum tariffs to push the total tax burden above 75% on certain product categories. The White House framed this as leveling the playing field. Critics, including trade analysts and Canadian officials, called it something closer to economic coercion, dressed up in legal language nobody had tested in court for 3/4 of a century. To understand how unusual this maneuver really was, you have to look at what Section 338 actually replaced. Under normal circumstances, a president wanting to impose tariffs on a trading partner has to go through one of a handful of established legal pathways. Section 301 of the Trade Act requires a formal investigation by the United States Trade Representative before any duty can be imposed, a process that typically takes months and involves public comment periods. Section 232 requires an official Commerce Department determination that imports pose a genuine national security threat, another process built around evidence and review. Section 338 requires none of that. No investigation, no national security finding, no congressional vote, nothing beyond a presidential signature and a finding that a foreign country is discriminating against American commerce. That is precisely why it was chosen. It offered speed and total executive discretion at a moment when the administration's more commonly used tools had just been stripped away by the courts. And it let the White House move from decision to deadline in a matter of weeks rather than months. Now here's where the story gets genuinely interesting, because Trump didn't just sign the tariffs, he talked about them repeatedly in a way that revealed exactly what he expected to happen next. At a General Motors plant in Michigan in late July, standing in front of cameras, he told reporters that Canada needs America, but America does not need Canada. He said Mexico and Canada need the United States, not the other way around. He said the trade relationship mattered more to Ottawa than to Washington. And on Fox News, just days after signing the Section 338 proclamations, when asked directly about the future of the broader trade agreement between the two countries, his answer was 4 words. I don't care. That is not the language of a negotiator looking for a deal. That is the language of someone who believes the other side has no leverage and no choice but to fold. This is exactly the assumption this entire trade war was built on. And it is exactly the assumption that turned out to be wrong. Because while Trump was talking tough on camera, Canada was doing something far more consequential behind the scenes, and it wasn't panicking. Prime Minister Mark Carney's background matters here more than most people realize. This is not a career politician improvising his way through a crisis. Carney holds an economics degree from Harvard, a master's, and a doctorate in economics from Oxford, and he spent 13 years at Goldman Sachs before entering public service. He served as governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013, steering the country through the global financial crisis better than almost any other developed economy managed. He then became governor of the Bank of England, the first person in that institution's 300-year history who wasn't British, navigating Brexit and the opening shock of the pandemic from inside one of the most consequential central banking seats on the planet. When a man with that resume decides to say nothing publicly while under direct pressure from the President of the United States, that silence is not weakness. It is a deliberate, calculated decision from someone who has managed systemic financial risk at a scale very few people in any generation ever will. And Carney's silence had a very specific strategic logic behind it, because Section 338 contains an escalation trap buried inside its own legal language. If Canada had retaliated publicly, and the United States determined that the retaliation increased the underlying discrimination the tariffs were meant to punish, the statute allowed Washington to escalate even further. In other words, if Ottawa had fired back with matching tariffs the way Ontario Premier Doug Ford was publicly demanding, Trump would have gained a legal justification to go higher still. Carney refused to give him that opening. At the first ministers' meeting in Charlottetown in July, when reporters pressed him on what retaliation Canada was considering, he said only that everything was on the table and declined to name a single measure, arguing it would be counterproductive to reveal his hand while negotiations were still underway. A poll from that period found that 62% of Canadians supported some form of retaliatory tariff, with a little more than a third wanting a dollar-for-dollar match. Carney's silence satisfied neither camp completely, and that discomfort is exactly what made it the right call, because announcing retaliation before the deadline would have handed away Canada's only remaining leverage in the room. While the silence held in public, 3 separate pressure points were quietly building against Washington, and none of them required Canada to say a single provocative word. The first was legal. Multiple trade law firms flagged, almost the moment the ink dried on the July 20th proclamations, that Section 338 rested on genuinely shaky ground. The same Supreme Court that struck down Trump's emergency tariff authority in February had established a clear standard that broad unilateral presidential tariff power requires explicit congressional authorization to survive judicial review. Section 338 arguably fails that same test, and legal scholars widely expected federal court challenges the moment the tariffs actually took effect. Canada had also signaled it would pursue parallel challenges through the World Trade Organization's dispute settlement process, and it had already used the dispute mechanism inside the existing North American trade agreement to win a previous fight over American dairy policy. That combination, domestic litigation on one front and international arbitration on the other, meant Washington was defending a legally uncertain tariff regime on multiple fronts simultaneously while the countdown clock kept running. The second pressure point was economic, and it was building inside the United States itself, not inside Canada. The list of goods hit by Section 338 read like a supply chain for the American middle class: lumber, plywood, and cement feeding directly into home construction, at a moment when housing affordability was already one of the most politically sensitive issues in the country. Dairy inputs like whey, cream, and milk solids feeding into American food manufacturing. Auto parts crossing the border multiple times before becoming a finished vehicle, meaning a 50% tariff didn't stay in Canada. It traveled down the supply chain and landed directly on the cost of American-built cars. General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis all operate deeply integrated cross-border manufacturing networks, And American vehicle exports to Canada had already fallen by roughly 22%, a drop worth more than $5.5 billion in the year leading into this standoff. The United Steelworkers Union publicly called the tariff deadline one of the most consequential trade dates in decades. And that is not language coming from the sidelines. Those are workers whose cross-border supply chains sat directly in the crossfire. Beyond the direct tariff exposure, there was a second, quieter economic reality working against Washington's position, and it involved the goods, Section 338, deliberately left untouched. Canadian energy, crude oil, natural gas, and electricity were excluded from the proclamations entirely. So it was potash, the mineral essential to fertilizing American farmland, along with critical minerals like uranium, tellurium, and niobium that feed directly into electric vehicles, semiconductors, and defense manufacturing. Those exclusions were not acts of generosity. They were the White House quietly acknowledging exactly where its own vulnerability sat. The United States relies on Canada for the overwhelming majority of its potash imports, and American refineries across the Midwest are specifically engineered to process Canadian heavy crude, infrastructure that cannot be swapped to another supplier without billions of dollars in retrofits and years of transition planning. Trump had floated tariffs on Canadian potash back in late 2025 and quietly abandoned the idea within weeks after agricultural lobbies in the American Midwest pushed back hard. In other words, Washington built its own tariff proclamation by first identifying every category where Canada actually held leverage and carving those categories out before the fight even began. That is not the posture of a negotiator holding all the cards. That is a negotiating position with a very visible ceiling built by the very administration imposing it. 36 American states count Canada as their single largest export market, not their second largest, their largest. That is not an abstract statistic sitting inside a policy paper somewhere. That is Wisconsin dairy farmers selling north across the border, Michigan auto parts suppliers integrated into Canadian assembly lines, Montana energy companies dependent on pipeline infrastructure that crosses the border in both directions. Those are real constituencies represented by real senators who sit on real trade oversight committees. And the pressure building inside those states doesn't make headlines the way a tariff proclamation does, but it accumulates, and it flows upward through the political system with increasing velocity the longer a standoff drags on. The third pressure point, and arguably the one Washington least expected, was structural. Canada had spent the better part of 2 years quietly building an alternative to its dependence on the American market. And by the time the August 19th deadline arrived, that alternative was no longer theoretical. It was signed, funded, and already moving trade data in a measurable direction. Start with the Port of Vancouver, which moves roughly $1 billion in goods every single day and connects Canada to 170 markets worldwide. In July 2026, the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority selected a construction partner to build the Roberts Bank Terminal 2 expansion, a project projected to unlock more than $100 billion in additional annual trade capacity while increasing the port's container handling capacity by 50%. That is not a press release promise. That is a signed construction partnership, backed by a memorandum of understanding moving toward a full operating agreement. Time to be finalized while the tariff standoff with Washington was still actively unresolved. Canada did not wait for the dispute to end before building its way around it. Then there is the trade diversification record itself, which reads less like diplomacy and more like a country executing a documented financial strategy under pressure. In late July 2026, in the same narrow window Trump was standing at a Michigan auto plant telling reporters Canada didn't matter, Ottawa signed a full free trade agreement with Ecuador eliminating tariffs on nearly all Ecuadorian exports, and on the very same day concluded a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with the United Arab Emirates, a negotiation that had only launched in November 2025 and was completed in just 47 days, a pace the UAE's own trade minister publicly called record time. The UAE had already pledged $70 billion in investment into Canada before that trade deal was even finalized, a figure representing far more than a bilateral trade relationship. It represents a sovereign wealth ecosystem managing trillions in global capital choosing to treat Canada as a standalone investment destination rather than simply America's northern neighbor. Layer on top of that a strategic economic partnership signed with China in January 2026 that cut Canadian canola tariffs from roughly 85% down to 15%, unlocking close to $3 billion Canadian dollars in near-term export orders. Layer on enhancements to the existing trade agreement with the European Union, an agreement that had already boosted Canada's exports to that bloc by more than 50% since it first came into force. Layer on active negotiations with India targeting a doubling of bilateral trade to $70 billion annually by 2030, exploratory talks with the Philippines, and a comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership membership that had already grown Canada's merchandise trade, with member nations by nearly 43% since 2019. By mid-2026, Carney's government had signed more than 20 new economic and security partnerships since the trade war with Washington first began. The Prime Minister himself had logged 26 foreign trips in his first year in office, a diplomatic pace unlike anything a Canadian leader had attempted in modern history. The stated target behind all of this activity is not modest. Carney's government set a formal goal of doubling Canada's non-American exports from roughly $300 billion annually to $600 billion within a decade, alongside unlocking $1 trillion in new international investment. Those are not campaign talking points. Those are figures now backed by signed construction contracts, ratified trade agreements, and measurable shifts in monthly export data. And the data had already started moving before the August deadline even arrived. In one recent month, Canada's merchandise exports to countries other than the United States surged by nearly 25%, one of the largest single-month increases ever recorded in Canadian trade statistics, while exports specifically bound for the United States fell by more than 6.5% in that same window, the sharpest such drop since the depths of the pandemic. Two numbers moving in opposite directions at that magnitude in the same reporting period is not political spin. That is a structural shift already underway, visible in the raw data long before any politician needed to spin it one way or another. It's worth pausing on just how integrated this relationship actually is, because the headline trade deficit numbers Washington leaned on throughout this fight told only part of the picture. Total goods and services trade between the two countries reached somewhere around $880 billion in the most recent full year of data, the second largest bilateral trading relationship the United States has anywhere on the planet. Canada was also the single largest destination for American exports of any country on Earth, absorbing more American-made goods than the United Kingdom, France, China, and Japan combined, according to figures compiled by the Congressional Research Service. The vast majority of that trade does not move in one direction and stop. It crosses the border multiple times as raw materials, components, and half-finished products pass back and forth between integrated factories before becoming a finished vehicle, appliance, or piece of machinery. Tariffing that flow does not simply tax Canadian exporters. It raises the cost of production for American manufacturers at every single stage of that cycle, which is exactly why groups like the United States Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers had been lobbying quietly but consistently against the most aggressive tariff measures since the earliest days of this trade war. Here is the part almost nobody explaining this trade war on cable news actually connects together. Trump's own tariffs were the accelerant for exactly the outcome he least wanted. Every proclamation, every dismissive Fox News comment, every public declaration that America didn't need Canada gave Carney's government more political justification at home to move faster on diversification. Trade wars are rarely one-directional, and the pressure Washington applied to Ottawa was simultaneously strengthening the exact case for building alternatives that Canadian economists had been making for years. It is the same lesson China's trade pressure on Australia taught the world a decade earlier. Push a trading partner hard enough, and if that partner has any credible alternative to build toward, the pressure itself becomes the catalyst that builds it faster. Now stop for a second and think about what this looked like from inside the White House as the August 19th deadline actually approached. This was supposed to be the moment of maximum leverage, the culmination of a Depression-era statute deployed specifically because it required no review and no delay. Instead, multiple people familiar with the negotiations told reporters just days before the deadline that the chances of a deal were, in their own words, a coin flip or worse. Canadian and American negotiators had already met 3 times in as many weeks in Washington, with Canada's trade minister and its chief negotiator spending entire weekends in the capital trying to close the gap. And then, less than 2 hours before the 50% tariffs were set to take effect at 1 minute past midnight, Trump posted that he was pausing his own deadline for 3 days, citing what he called a deal subject to the finalization of documents between the two countries. Read that sequence again because the order of events matters enormously. This was not Canada calling Washington begging for relief. This was the President of the United States delaying the enforcement of his own signature trade weapon less than 120 minutes before it was scheduled to hit, because the leverage he assumed he held simply hadn't materialized the way he expected. A senior Canadian official described the emerging terms as a very good deal for Canada. Trump, for his part, called the agreement very fair to both sides and predicted American farmers and manufacturers would benefit. Both of those statements can technically be true and still describe 2 very different outcomes, because the terms that leaked out in the days around the deadline told a much more specific story about who conceded what. Under the emerging framework, the tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, which had been sitting at 50%, would be cut roughly in half down to 25%. Tariffs on the non-American content inside Canadian exported vehicles would drop from 25% down to 15%. The threatened new round of tariffs on electronics, alcohol, and dairy, the very measures set to take effect that Wednesday, were shelved entirely as part of the agreement. In exchange, Canada agreed to a list of concessions around alcohol sales, dairy quota structuring, and government procurement rules. Concessions that matter, but concessions negotiated from a position where Washington had already backed off its most aggressive threat rather than deployed it. Trump also dangled the possible revival of the long-defunct Keystone XL pipeline project as part of the broader diplomatic thaw, a gesture that read less like the outcome of a country with no leverage and more like an attempt to hand Ottawa something tangible to help sell the deal back home. This is the part of the story that deserves real attention because a 50% tariff threat that gets negotiated down to 25% on some goods and 15% on others, 3 days later than originally announced after the country on the receiving end refused to publicly retaliate or panic, is not the outcome of a trade weapon working as intended. It is the outcome of a trade weapon meeting a country that had spent the better part of 2 years quietly building the leverage to say no. Think back to the historical parallel that trade lawyers kept raising the moment Section 338 was signed. This is the same law buried inside the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, the legislation that raised duties on more than 20,000 imported goods and is now remembered as one of history's most catastrophic economic policy mistakes. Over 1,000 economists signed a public petition begging President Hoover not to sign it. Henry Ford himself spent an evening at the White House urging a veto. Hoover signed it anyway, and global trade collapsed by roughly 65% between 1929 and 1934, with American farmers, the exact constituency the law was designed to protect, ending up among its biggest casualties. Reaching back into that same statute nearly a century later to pressure a neighbor and longtime ally carries an uncomfortable structural echo, because tariffs designed to punish a trading partner tend to create collateral damage inside the very economy imposing them, and that is precisely what started happening here before the deadline even arrived. There is also a longer-term lesson sitting underneath all of this that matters more than any single tariff rate negotiated down by a few percentage points. Once new supply chains form, once a country signs a $100 billion port expansion, once it locks in a 20-year energy contract with a European buyer, once it builds a $1 trillion investment relationship with a Gulf sovereign wealth fund, that infrastructure does not simply disappear the moment a tariff dispute gets resolved. Canada's diversification strategy continues regardless of what happens in any single negotiating round with Washington, because the ports are being built, the contracts are being signed, the trade data is already moving in the direction Ottawa wants it to go. Even the current agreement, whatever its final signed language ends up looking like, only reduces tariffs. It does not eliminate them. And it does nothing to reverse the structural work Canada has already done to reduce how much any single relationship, even its most important one, can dictate its economic future. Here's the honest complication in this story, the part a purely celebratory narrative would skip over. The United States still remains overwhelmingly Canada's largest trading partner, and nothing that happened around this deadline changes that fact in the short term. Roughly 70% of Canadian exports still flow south of the border, down only modestly from where that share sat a year earlier. Canada's economy absorbed real pain throughout this standoff, with manufacturing output falling, tens of thousands of jobs lost in sectors like steel, aluminum, and auto parts, and the country's own growth forecasts getting revised downward as trade policy uncertainty weighed on investment decisions. Diversification headlines can represent genuine, measurable progress and still be insufficient to offset the core relationship at the same time. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and any serious analysis of this standoff has to hold both ideas together rather than picking the version that makes for a cleaner headline. But here is why the direction of travel matters more than the current balance sheet. Trade leverage only works on a country with no alternative. The moment credible alternatives exist, signed, funded, and already shifting trade data, the leverage calculus does not just weaken. It starts to reverse, deal by deal, quarter by quarter. Washington built an entire negotiating strategy around the assumption that Canada had nowhere else to go, and that assumption drove the decision to reach for a Depression-era statute nobody had used in nearly 80 years, to publicly declare that the relationship mattered more to Ottawa than to Washington, and to set a hard deadline expecting capitulation. What actually happened was a president delaying his own deadline with less than 2 hours to spare, cutting his own tariff rates roughly in half on the sectors that mattered most, and calling the outcome fair rather than a win, while the country on the other side of the table had spent the standoff signing port expansions, energy contracts, and trade agreements across 4 continents that will outlast this particular fight, regardless of how the final paperwork reads. That is what a backfire actually looks like in modern trade policy. Not a dramatic collapse, not a headline-grabbing capitulation, but a slow, data-driven erosion of leverage that forces the side holding the bigger stick to negotiate down from its own opening position, while the other side never had to raise its voice in public even once. Every earnings call where an American CEO mentioned Canadian tariff exposure, every senator from one of the 36 states that depend on Canada as their top export market, every home builder warning that lumber and cement tariffs were making the housing affordability crisis worse, all of that pressure accumulated quietly on the American side of the border, while Canada's official public posture never moved past a handful of carefully chosen words about keeping everything on the table. The August 19th deadline is not really the end of this story, even with a tentative agreement now on the table. The steel and aluminum rate cut to 25% is still a real tariff. The auto rate cut to 15% is still a real tariff. Legal challenges to Section 338's underlying authority have not disappeared just because a short-term deal was reached, and multiple trade law firms still expect that authority to be tested in federal court, regardless of how these negotiations resolve. The broader renegotiation of the underlying North American trade agreement, the review process that began back in July, remains unresolved and could stretch into a multi-year process with its own separate deadlines and its own separate pressure points. Nothing about this moment is permanently settled, and anyone telling you it is has stopped reading the fine print. What is settled, at least for now, is the answer to the question this entire standoff was built to test. Does a maximum pressure tariff deadline, deployed through a law dusted off after nearly 8 decades of dormancy, force a smaller trading partner to fold on Washington's terms? And the answer that played out in real time in the trade data, in the negotiating room, and in the final hours before that deadline was no. Canada didn't fold. It built ports. It signed energy contracts. It doubled down on markets across Asia, the Gulf, South America, and Europe. It kept its retaliation options completely hidden until the very end, denying Washington any intelligence about where the real pressure points sat. And when the deadline finally arrived, it was the country that set it who found a reason to move it back by 3 days and settle for roughly half the tariff rate it had spent a month threatening. If this breakdown helped you see the numbers behind the headlines, do the usual, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because this fight is far from finished and the fine print of this agreement is going to matter for years. Drop a comment and tell me whether you think this deal holds, or whether August 19th just became the first round of a much longer fight. And if you know someone who still thinks this trade war is only about hockey sticks and dairy quotas, share this with them, because the real story was never really about either one.